morning. I'm Gene Parker, veterinarian with Oklahoma State University Cooperative Extension Service. We're out here this morning. I've been watching a group of does move out of this oak timber, eating these acorns, moving down to this pond each morning. We're here today to hopefully harvest one of these does and then also show the technique and describe the process of field dressing deer in such a way that we optimize food safety and prevent any contamination at the critical points. You know, deer hunting is the most popular hunting sport in Oklahoma. In 2007, if you combine archery, primitive firearm, and deer gun season, 350,000 deer licenses were issued. The total harvest in 2007 was in excess of 120,000 deer. Hopefully everyone has the experience and knowledge once the deer's on the ground to get it to the table in great shape. However, sometimes we are challenged by the temperature and the conditions to make sure our food safety is good. Today we're going to cover these aspects and hopefully demonstrate some techniques so that your product's good when it's home on the table. We're going to ease down here now and see if we can find any of these deer. Well, it's a great morning to be out in the woods. This is pretty typical conditions for Oklahoma deer season in November. We've got about a 30-mile-an-hour wind blowing out of the north. It's cool, crisp. The wind will help cover some of the sound, and the wind in my face, we ought to be in great shape. The deer been moving out of this timber over here to my left, across this open bottom, down to that pond. So maybe within a few minutes, we'll get lucky and spot some deer. This would be a good time to talk about hunter orange requirements. Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation requires that all deer gun hunters have 400 square inches of fluorescent daylight orange above the waist, and that includes having a head covering. We're all covered there. Maybe in a few minutes we'll be lucky and see some deer. Oh, that's beautiful. Beautiful shot. Beautiful deer. There's a lot of things you can do pre-harvest to ensure you have a better hunt. Courteous hunters respect the game they pursue. And one of the most courteous things you can do and respectful to the game that we're hunting is clean, one-shot kills. These animals that come out at rest, they're walking, they're natural, they're relaxed, and harvested like this make great table fare. We know from the beef cattle industry that if we stress out animals, have intense physical exercise, or get real nervous before slaughter, that they end up being what we call dark cutters. And that would be where an animal such as a deer, if you wounded this deer and ran him and shot at him 2 or 3 times, or ran him with dogs, or stressed him out, he would be a dark cutter. This is what the deer hunters know imparts a bad flavor to the meat. The meat will be dark, it'll have a bad taste, and it'll be tough. So there's a couple of things you can do to ensure that your product on the table will be good, and one is to be courteous enough to the wildlife to make a clean one-shot kill. Now that this animal's definitely down, we're going to get these guns unloaded and proceed. An important point to keep in mind is even while unloading your firearm, keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. Now that we've determined that this is a clean one-shot kill, we got our firearms put up and unloaded, we won't need them anymore. The next step is to tag this deer. The tag purchased has a requirement that immediately upon harvest, you write down the date, the type of game, and the method you've taken, and you tear or punch out this so that it cancels the tag. So I'm going to tear this out, and go ahead and fill out this tag. Now this is a requirement. I have a lifetime hunting and fishing license. That means I don't have to purchase an annual tag. However, even if you're a lifetime hunting and fishing license holder, you still have to attach your name to this carcass immediately on harvest with your hunting license number on it. I just use a business card and write my hunting license on there. If you have the gun tag that you purchased and you canceled it out by filling in the correct information, it has your name and the license on there, so you can just attach this. If not, you need to attach something else. I always keep just a little zip tie with the license and the tag, and immediately upon harvest, attach this to the carcass, and then there's no confusion as to what hunter harvested this animal. The next thing, before we start field dressing this deer, is just to go over to keep your hunter orange on. You may have dressed very warm this morning when you left the house, and at this point in time, it's time to shed some clothes and get down to the field dressing part. However, leave your hunter orange on. At some point in time, when we're through with this process, we're going to drag, carry, or transport this deer out of the woods, and at that point in time, we don't want to draw a lot of attention to ourselves by other hunters that may be in the woods. So leave your hunter orange on. Before we start field dressing this deer, we always want to wear rubber gloves. Latex gloves will help prevent the transmission or possible transmission of any kind of diseases that the animal can carry. Wild game can carry diseases like brucellosis, tuberculosis, and several tick-transmitted diseases like Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Ehrlichia. It's not very likely that there would be a transmission, but it's a good idea to wear these. I've been field dressing deer for about 30 years and just recently started wearing gloves. I always clean deer barehanded. However, I find that it keeps my steering wheel clean on the way home if I'll wear these while I field dress the deer. The first thing we're going to do is probably the most difficult, and that's to start at the back end of the deer. I brought a deer pelvis to demonstrate exactly what I'm going to talk about when we open up the back end of this deer. If we're going to open it up, the deer just happens to be lying correctly with its head downhill. That way gravity will pull the intestines away from it and not cause so much pressure here towards the back. This is a deer pelvis, and since the deer's going to be lying upside down, it's going to be like this, and we're going to talk about freeing up the soft tissue around the pelvic canal. And this is what we're talking about right in here. This will give you a little bit better idea as the guidelines and the boundaries so that we can free that up. We'll start here. The best thing is to have a sharp knife. Very sharp knife makes this job a lot easier. We're going to make a small football shaped or elliptical incision around the anus. This is the external opening of the digestive tract, and if this were a doe, we would also have the vulva or the external opening of the urinary tract, and we would want our elliptical incision to encompass both of these. However, this is a buck deer, so we'll be able to just make our incision here and then continue it forward. You always want to slide your knife under the skin and cut in a motion coming up. If you try and cut from the top going down or saw this, you'll find that you'll drag the hair into the meat. If you can see while we're getting here right around the anus, you see that there's several ticks attached. This is the type of thing that we talked about that wearing the rubber gloves helps prevent. Also, around the anus and the vulva, this is an area of high possible contamination just because they urinate and defecate in this area. So when we finish with this, we'd either like to switch our knife or disinfect it. Okay, we finished our incision around the anus, and what we want to do now is just to continue this incision forward up here to the testicles and the penis. Now this procedure, this part would not need to be performed, obviously, if we had a doe. Now some states require that evidence of sex be left on them. So if your state requires that a testicle be attached so that you'll have proof of sex of the animal, you may have to do that. Okay, we're going to free up this the penis and the testicles and just dissect it back to the pelvic canal. Now once we're back here to the pelvic canal, once again, we use our pelvic brim as a boundary. Penis is going to come right here and go inside there with the rectum, and we're going to carve around this area here. I'm going to go ahead and disinfect my knife and my gloves. It's always nice to carry some type of disinfectant wipe with you, and multiple times through this procedure, and especially any time that there's any kind of contamination, it's very nice to clean these off. Myself, I like to bring 2 or 3 knives. I don't stop too often to disinfect it. I'll just change knives. I find that if one goes dull, I've always got an extra one. So don't hesitate to disinfect the knife and your gloves often. Now we're going to kind of dissect around the pelvic canal to free up this so that we can pull it through to the inside. You can take your knife, I don't know how well you can see this, and as long as you keep the knife pointed in, you can cut around here without fear of hitting the rectum or the bladder. What we don't want to do is rupture the bladder and get some urine contamination. It's pretty easy to feel as the blade floats around on the inside of that bony pelvis where you actually need to be cutting. We want to free this up, and once you can see that it's moving pretty freely, we know that it'll pull through. Now at this point in time, there are several techniques described. One is to take a piece of string and tie this off so that when you pull it through from the inside, you don't have any leakage of the manure or the urine. The other is to take a rubber band. I carry a zip tie to attach the tag, so that's what I like to do. Put this zip tie around here. Make sure you get the rectum and the urinary tract together. And then just pull that tight, and that way as you pull it into the body cavity, you won't have any leakage. I'm going to go ahead and cut the penis here, get that out of the way, and we're ready to open the abdomen. As I mentioned before, you want to stop and disinfect your knife frequently. After we work around the rectum, which has a high probability of contamination, we want to either clean our knife or switch knives before we proceed. I'm going to go ahead and clean this knife off. And then from where we want our deer's head still pointed slightly downhill to take the pressure off the abdomen, we're going to, towards the forward part of our incision, we're going to make an incision into the abdomen, just barely going in, not to nick any of the intestines or any of the abdominal contents. Now, this deer was a clean heart-lung shot, so we shouldn't have any contamination of the abdominal cavity. Once we get into the abdominal cavity, there are 2 ways you can proceed. First, we're going to go ahead and keeping our knife between the abdomen and the skin, we're going to cut forward up towards the chest. Going to continue it right up past the sternum, all the way to the base of the throat. Now, some hunters, the first thing they do when they start this procedure is to cut the throat or cut somewhere to hit a large vessel and bleed the animal out. If you get a heart lung shot like we did here, the animal's going to bleed out on the inside. When we open the chest, all the blood's going to be there. So it's not necessary to cut the throat and bleed the animal out if you've got it harvested properly. Now, after we've opened the skin from our scrotal incision all the way forward to the throat, we're going to open and go inside the abdominal cavity. Two ways you can do this. One is after you make your small incision, put 2 fingers in, side by side, put your knife blade between them, and walk it forward. By elevating the abdomen like this, you won't nick or you won't cut any of the intestines. You won't have any of the contamination of that sort of thing into the meat. The other option is to use a knife that has what they call a gut hook on it. And this is a small hook on the knife that doesn't allow it to get into the intestines and release any of the intestinal contents which would contaminate the meat. This is one such knife that has the gut hook. Just take the gut hook, put it in there, pull forward, then it will open the abdomen like that without hitting any of the internal organs. Now once we get to right here, this is the tip of the sternum, and this is where we start dealing with the chest cavity. Some people will try to carve this out and reach forward without opening up the chest itself. However, in Oklahoma, much of the time like today, it's going to heat up. We're going to have temperatures over 40 degrees shortly, and we're going to need to get this animal opened up and hung up in the air to get it cooled off to preserve the carcass quality. So we're going to go ahead and open the chest back up. We're going to go ahead and proceed and open up the chest. You can do this with a knife. The sternum is made out of cartilage. It's not ossified bone, so it can be cut through with a knife. However, in very large or older animals, or animals like elk, sometimes it's nice to use a saw. I have a friend that gave me this saw, and it's just a little portable hand saw. It works great to cut these. A lot of field processing kits will have a saw blade that you can attach to your knife. This being a young deer, we're just going to go ahead and split it with the knife. And when you get it far enough forward to the first rib, you'll notice that it'll just want to fall open on you. As we open up the chest cavity, you'll notice there's a lot of blood and a lot of hemorrhage because we had a heart-lung shot that was directed quite well. You'll notice that there's a small sheet-like muscle here on each side. This is a diaphragm. The diaphragm is this small, thin muscle that separates the chest cavity containing the heart and lungs from the abdominal cavity containing the stomach and the intestines and organs of digestion. You want to take your knife and along the side here, just cut it off as it attaches to the rib cage. This is pretty easy to do. It's a very thin muscle. You can see it just runs along the rib cage, and you can cut that back as far as you can. You all want to take and dissect the soft tissue loose around here to free up the heart. And what we're going to do now is reach down here and cut the esophagus and the trachea. Now the trachea, or the windpipe, is a rigid structure. It's made out of cartilaginous rings. So when you reach down in here, it's going to feel like the roll on the inside of a pair of paper towels, the cardboard roll. It's going to be firm structure. We're going to reach down here and grab that. We can feel that. We're going to go as far forward as we can, pulling it, and then cut that loose. That's the main attachment towards the head, and all this will start to loosen up. Now, once we've cut the trachea and the esophagus, we just start to pull contents back, and as we do, the intestines, we may have to trim our diaphragm a little bit more. As you can see, with nothing more than gentle traction and pressure, all this will just roll out. When we get the main portion of the abdominal contents out, we want to direct our attention towards the back. A while ago, we elevated around the pelvic canal. We loosened up the rectum and the urinary tract, and we put a zip tie on it. Now we want to pull that through the pelvic inlet. You'll see as we put traction on it, it wants to start to slip. Just going to free up right here, terminal rectum, and as you'll notice, it all comes right through. We've got the bladder intact, not leaking any urine, no contamination, and the rectum tied off. So mission accomplished. After we get the whole digestive tract out of the deer and the contents of the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity, we want to take a stick and prop the chest open. We want to try and get some air movement through here and help cool this off. The other thing we want to do now is elevate this deer up, and as you'll watch back there by its tail, you'll start to notice that all the blood will drain out of this animal. Now, not only does this get it cleaned out, but also the flushing action. If there was some contamination there in the pelvis, it would flush that out. At this point in time, we got a relatively clean deer, heart and lung shot, no abdominal contents, wasn't gut shot. Everything looks good. If it doesn't look good, if your deer happened to have some abdominal contents, if it was gut shot, if it's got some intestinal contents that loosen the abdomen, you might want to take paper towels and wipe it out. That's probably about all you can do until you can get it back to where you can get a water hose and hose it out. There are 3 big problems that affect meat quality that we encounter right now: heat, moisture, and contamination. All 3 of these things combine to cause bacterial growth, which will cause the meat to sour or to go bad. The best thing you can do is to get the animal open like we have it here, prop it open, and get air movement around it. The other thing is to get it up off the ground. The hair and the hide around this animal laying down on the ground, it just provides to insulate it and keep the heat in the carcass. If you can hang this animal in a tree or on the fence, or get it hung up and allow the air to circulate around it. Today, we're at about 45 degrees. The normal body temperature of this deer is around 103, so we can drop it about 60 degrees real quick just by hanging it up, getting it open, and that sort of thing. The next is moisture. When we can get this animal completely field dressed like this and wipe it out with some paper towels, we remove the moisture component. Contamination. We've spent the last several minutes describing how to field dress this deer to prevent contamination. We didn't allow any urinary tract, any fecal contamination from manure. We didn't have any intestinal content contamination. This deer is a really clean deer. Now we have other sources of contamination like mud, water, grass, that sort of thing. So if you're going to drag this deer out of here, You want to be careful. Some people even advocate sewing the abdomen back up to keep hair and dirt and water and that sort of thing out of it. You can carry the deer out, or we're going to throw it on the back of the four-wheeler and take it up to the truck and go check this deer in. The last thing I'm going to do is police the area, pick up all of my trash, dispose of it properly, carry out anything I brought in, and according to disposition of the rest of this carcass, you just want to be sure your state and local laws dispose of it according to that.
Once you get your deer to the vehicle, avoid tying the deer across the hood of your truck. The heat off the engine could spoil the meat. Also, don't tie your deer over the cab of your vehicle. The sun on the metal could also heat up and spoil the meat, and the side of a deer carcass could offend the non-hunting public. Also, we want the carcass to have good air circulation, so don't wrap it with a tarp or a plastic bag. And if the air temperature gets above 60 degrees, put a couple bags of ice into the abdomen to keep the animal cool during transport to the check station.
So here we are at Oklahoma Department of Wildlife certified hunter check station. Regulations require that once the animal is removed from the field, you must be en route to the nearest hunter check station. We arrived with our deer license intact, the name and license number of the harvesting hunter on here. At the hunter check station, the animal's weighed, aged, sex is determined, and also the points on the antlers counted, and that information is kept by the Department of Wildlife for management plans that they have. We're also given a carcass tag. This tag should be attached to the carcass, and now it can go to its final destination, whether that be a locker plant for processing commercially, or if you're going to do it in the shop or your barn or your garage at home, this has to accompany the deer to its final destination and consumption. So you have to keep it with the meat even in the freezer. And now we've arrived at the final destination, a little home processing. After we checked it in at a Department of Wildlife approved check station, we got our carcass tag, which has accompanied us here to the final destination. You can notice that just a couple hours ago we harvested this deer, and we've got her cooled down, we've got her open with a lot of air circulation. She's dried out. We're going to take a water hose here and just kind of clean a little of this blood off, pull the hide off of her, and then start the processing. This is a pretty ideal type of situation. We don't have a lot of contamination. We had a nice clean kill with no gut shot or ruptured abdominal contents, but we're going to go ahead and finish the job, which is just clean her up with a little bit of water and then pull the hide off of it and start processing. Got the deer opened up and we got her cleaned out with a water hose, and you can see everything's fresh, everything looks good. We talked about the three big culprits of causing meat to spoil, and that was heat, temperature or heat, moisture, and contamination. Even if this deer 2 hours ago when we harvested it did have some contamination, being gut shot or having some manure or urine contaminating the meat, if here it is less than 2 hours later and we've got her hung up, cleaning her out, that contamination won't be an infection or any bacterial growth. So the speed at which you do this and get the carcass cooled off, dried off, processed, and in the freezer has a lot to do with it too. But everything looks good here. We're going to peel the hide off of her and then go ahead and start processing these cuts. Final destination with our newly harvested deer. We've got the hide pulled off about 90%, got her cleaned up, trimmed off everything, Everything looks good here. Just a few points to mention so that if you're processing this at home, you'll know what is okay and what's not. I've processed deer that have had previous gunshot wounds, had broadheads from arrows stuck in them, had lots of problems. You'll see lots of things out there once you get to processing a few deer. So things to look for is if you have a foul odor, if you have a greenish or whitish discharge, if you have any dark or discoloration of the meat. These are things that tip you off. This might not be a carcass that would be edible. This is the hemorrhage from the gunshot wound, and obviously this can be trimmed off. This is fresh. So this would be something that would want to be removed. As of this, any of the dark discolored meat, you say, well, what's discolored? You should have a real nice cherry or crimson red appearance to the meat. If it's got this dark blue or real dark red, almost towards a black, that needs to be trimmed. Now this is fresh trauma from, like I said, the gunshot wound. If you have an old one, you'll have a lot of infection, drainage, that sort of thing. You might want to trim a lot, or you might want to even consider not eating that deer. When we take out the intestines and you saw us field dress it, all the lymph nodes came with that. However, there are some regional lymph nodes located in the body. Lymph nodes are what respond to infection, and you do not want to consume those if possible. Now, all the lymph nodes, or most all the lymph nodes, are located in the fatty or subcutaneous tissue. So if you clean the carcass up like we have here and remove all the excess subcutaneous fat that's between the hide and the muscle, you usually don't have a problem. There are some major lymph nodes located right in front of each knee and right in front of each shoulder. They also are one located on the back of each leg. And you say, well, if we find a lymph node, is that bad? No, there's not a deer alive that doesn't have a lymph node. Here are some pictures of lymph nodes. And these are normal looking lymph nodes. They would be anywhere from a green pea to maybe a marble to as big as a small pecan, and those are normal. And these are pictures of lymph nodes. These you want to trim off if you see them, and if you remove most of the subcutaneous and abdominal fat, you're going to remove them anyway. This one right here I left attached to the fat. Since we've removed the fat and cleaned up this carcass and it's ready for processing, we're in great shape.
An option to home processing is to take the deer to a commercial locker plant. You need to deliver the clean carcass to the processor as quickly as possible, especially if the outside air temperature is above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This carcass has been washed and chilled already. Processing begins by removing the front legs by cutting between the shoulder blade and the rib cage. The processing today is done by Kyle Flynn at the Robert M. Kerr Food and Ag Products Center at OSU. The front legs and shoulders are usually used for ground meat products such as hamburger, chili meat, or summer sausage. This area typically has bloodshot, bullet, and bone fragments that have to be removed or trimmed out. Bloodshot is dark red tissue that has been damaged during the kill. These are small areas of hemorrhage in the muscle from bullet fragments or splintering rib bones. Red meat is removed following the bone. This is a boneless deer processing. By not cutting into the bones or spinal column, risk from diseases such as CWD, chronic wasting disease, may be eliminated. The sharper the knife, the safer and the easier the process usually is. Workers at packing houses are also required to use other safety equipment such as mesh aprons and cut-proof gloves. Individuals processing deer at home usually do not have this level of protection, so be very careful. Processors are also careful to keep contaminated meat away from the cuts they want to keep, which is a good idea for home processors as well. Next, the flank is removed and will be used for grinding. The sirloin tip or knuckle is also removed by cutting underneath the joint on the back of the leg and following the bone down. The tenderloins are two small muscles on the inside of the body cavity, just underneath the backbone. This is the same small muscle as on a T-bone steak and is where the fillet comes from. This is the most tender cut of meat in the carcass. The tenderloin is removed by cutting down the backbone and rolling it out. Any parts of the flank that are dried or contaminated with dirt or fecal matter must be removed. The cap is pulled off the sirloin tip to make a roast. The sirloin tip roast can be cut into steaks, or it can be sliced thin for jerky. The fat is peeled off the tenderloins. The back strap or loin is removed by cutting down and peeling off the backbone. The back strap is where most of the steaks come from. Excess fat is removed, then the tough silver connective tissue is filleted off. The loin can be left as a roast or cut into chops or steaks. The processor usually asks what type of cut you want and the thickness. The meat on the outside of the ribs is saved for trim, and the meat between the ribs is removed for grinding also. How much meat can be saved all depends on shot placement and carcass contamination during field dressing. Rarely can you get deer spare ribs because this is usually the location of the wound. The heart-lung region is the desired shot placement area. At this point, although there is still some meat on the carcass, removing it is very labor-intensive and processors tend not to do it. The hindquarters may now be separated from the carcass. For a truly boneless processing, the muscles of the hindquarter may be trimmed off the pelvic bones without cutting through the spinal cord. Bad areas are trimmed out. The round is separated by cutting down the pelvic bone. The inside of the round is often dried out or contaminated during field dressing and must be trimmed away. The round can be cut into roasts, steaks, or jerky. The top and bottom muscles of the round can be further separated. According to the law, the carcass tag should stay with the carcass to its final destination. This means that legally, the tag must accompany the meat all the way to your freezer.
Tasty, and a lot of people in Oklahoma really like it, but it's different than buying meat at the supermarket because nobody has checked to make sure that this meat is safe. So you have a lot more responsibility to make sure you maintain the safety of the meat as you bring it into your home and prepare it for your family. So today we're going to start with one of the preparation methods, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the meat as we go. I'm going to be stewing meat because a lot of the meat on venison does not fall into the nice tender steak category. Very little of it does that. So most of the things that we're going to cook are going to require a slow, moist cooking method in order to make the meat flavorful. So I've started with 1/4 of a cup of flour, 1/8 of a teaspoon of black pepper, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. And I'm simply going to stir those together just a tad, just to get them initially blended. I'm going to use this to dredge our venison. Now I'm starting with meat from the chuck. Or from the shoulder of the animal, and that means that it is tough meat. So I've cut it into fairly small pieces, and we're going to cook it for a long, slow time. Now, as we get this going, I'm also going to put a little bit of canola oil into our pan, about a tablespoon, and our pan should be fairly hot. So I should be able to start getting this in here real quick, and before. You want to make sure that the meat is hot enough, or the pan is hot enough, that the meat starts to sizzle as soon as you get it in. You also want to make sure that the meat doesn't stew while it's in here, because the only reason we're doing this is not to make sure that we sear the outside so the meat stays juicy, because that simply is a myth. It doesn't work. What we're doing this for is to make sure we get a lot of flavor. So we're going to get a little bit of brownness and a lot of that great flavor, and we're going to want to make sure that we get the flavors that are left in the pan as we go. So we're going to put a little liquid in the pan after we get the meat out to make sure we get some of that too. Now you'll notice as I'm working with the meat, you can see it particularly on the cuts we have here that haven't been cut into smaller pieces yet. You see you have this silvery membrane on the outside. There's actually two. This one is very tough, and you want to remove that one as you prepare the meat. You can also see another place here where you see a much thinner silver membrane. That one you can keep. That one is fine, and it's going to soften up enough or not cause any problems, so we'll be able to work with that. Once you get your meat in here, get it all dredged with flour, we're going to cook it for about 4 minutes. Now our goal with meat, because remember you're the last link here in the food safety chain and you didn't have anybody inspecting it before you got it, it is not difficult for venison when you're harvesting it and field dressing it to get a hole in spread fecal matter on the meat. If you have meat that has a lot of fecal matter on it, then you need to wash it off, and you can use it for cooking because we need to make sure we get it up to 160 degrees, and that will take care of the potential E. coli that you might get as a result of that. You should not, however, use that meat to make jerky because the temperature that you're going to get, the conditions that you're going to use may not be sufficient to make sure that that meat is going to be safe. So we're going to get it, most of it here in the pan. I started with about a pound of meat here. Another interesting thing about venison, you'll notice that it's darker red, and a lot of that is because the meat has more capillaries than beef and some of the traditional meats that we use, and as a result of that it has more blood, and that blood gives it that nice red flavor that we associate with wild game a little bit more. It also gives it the sweetness because blood has blood sugar in it, and that provides the sweetness. If, however, you cook it too long, you cook away some of that sweetness and you start getting more of the gamey flavor coming back out. So we want to make sure that while you cook meat well, you also, if you're using it in this kind of preparation, you want to add some ingredients that will help bring some of that sweetness back to the meat as you go. So you want to add things like onion, carrots, peas to the process. Anything that's going to have a little bit of natural sweetness will help you do that. You also want to make sure that you add something acidic that will help counteract any of that bitterness that develops as you begin to cook the meat. And because this is a long cooking process, you're going to have an increased amount of bitterness. Before you actually start cooking, however, especially if you're working with a loin or a piece off the back or off the top of the rump, those meats have less connective tissue in them, and so they can cook a shorter time and still end up being very tender. So what the goal is there is to cook it very hot for a very short time. And before you do that, however, you want to try and soak the meat either in a tablespoon of salt mixed with a quart of water or a cup of vinegar mixed with a quart of water. Soak that in the refrigerator overnight, and if there's any of that gamey flavor left in the meat, that will help take that out. Also remember to trim off all the fat. You can see that venison is already very, very lean, but if you look at it closely, you'll notice that in this area here we still have some fat. This tissue here you'll need to remove. It's not fat, but removing that also will help remove the gamey flavor too. The gamey flavor in venison is going to be primarily housed in the fat. So getting all of that off can really help you end up with a more flavorful product. You want to brown this for about 4 minutes so that you get it browned on all the sides pretty well. It doesn't have to be completely cooked, obviously. We're going to put it in a crock pot or a slow cooker and continue the cooking there. So we're just developing the flavor at this point. Getting it brown on all sides is what's going to do that for you. So I'm going to turn it off and take it over to the area where we have the crock pot set up. Our meat is ready. Now we're just actually going to set the meat aside for a few minutes because we need to load the slow cooker, and you need to load yours according to manufacturer's directions. I'm using a lot of vegetables, as you can see, and vegetables actually cook more slowly in a slow cooker than the meat does. So we want to put the meat on the top in this particular model, and actually in most models as well. So what we're going to add to this is about 2 cups of red onions, or you could use a golden onion that you've cubed in 1.5 inch pieces. Also going to add to that a cup of carrots, again in big chunks. This is going to be in the slow cooker for 7 to 8 hours, so we're going to have plenty of time. I've got about a cup of celery, also in big chunks, which makes it easier to prepare because it doesn't take as long to cut big chunks as little ones. A cup of onion, or one medium onion, depending on which comes first. I've got a couple of cloves of garlic that I've minced up. And just get those in here. And you could actually do the preparation of the vegetables the night before and just store them all in one container so that you're ready to go the next morning. I'm going to put in 2 cups of mushrooms that have been quartered unless they were small, in which case I just did them in halves. What we're trying to do here is increase the amount of vegetables we get, because Americans get plenty of meat. What we don't get in general is plenty of vegetables. So we're going to serve this in a way that benefits the meat by cooking it long and slow, and also adds a lot more vegetables than a lot of us are used to putting on the table at any one time. I'm going to add 1/3 cup of tomato paste. Now this is that acid. Remember, I mentioned that if you add some acid, then as the meat cooks over a long, slow period of time, it's going to help eliminate any of the bitterness that might develop as that meat cooks, since you're going to be cooking away the sweetness. So try and get most of that off of there, and just spread it around a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, because you're going to stir it in later on after the cooking is done. Now also on here we're going to add quite a few herbs, I have a let me follow down and make sure what I do have. I have a teaspoon of oregano. Now I'm using dried oregano. If you have fresh oregano, you use about 3 times that much. So you use about a tablespoon, because drying concentrates the flavors as things are dried. I'm adding 1/2 teaspoon of dried thyme, and the same thing here. You'd use a teaspoon of fresh. I'm using 1/2 teaspoon of dried rosemary. Now dried rosemary is something that you need to crush up a little bit in your fingers, and that's going to release some of the oils that have all the flavor in them. So I'm just going to squeeze it around and crush it down, and then I'm going to stir it over the top, or spread it over the top there. Then I also am going to add 3/4 of a teaspoon of pepper, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. That has set up on me just a little bit here with humidity. I have 1 bay leaf and 1½ teaspoons of sugar. So we have carrots, we have onions, and we have a little bit of sugar that are going to be in here for sweetness to also counteract any bitterness as this cooks. And now we're ready for one of the last ingredients here. We're actually going to add our venison to this. Stir this, or just spread it over the top. We need to stir any of these ingredients together. They're just going to cook for a long period of time, and when the cooking is about done, then we can come back and actually stir them together at that point in time. Now, I've got 3 cups of broth. You could either use beef broth from can. I'm using a reduced sodium variety and a lower fat variety. You could use whatever kind of broth you have, vegetable variety. You could even use the liquid that comes off canned vegetables. That's a good way to use those ingredients up. Now notice that we have all these little pieces here in the pan, and I want to get quite a few of those into our big crock pot, because that's a lot of flavor as well. So we'll kind of stir that around just a little bit to get that going. Set that there while we kind of get this in this pan. Use 2 hands there and really get it going. And with a little bit more effort, you could get a lot more of those tasty pieces off of there. And then finally, we are going to pour the rest of this broth over the top. Remember, this is about 3 cups or 2 cans. It's a stew, so it doesn't have to be exact when you go through there. Now we're going to turn this on low and let this just sit for the day, for 7.5, 8 hours, somewhere in that area. So you can get this all in the pan. You can do a lot of the preparation the night before, just brown the meat and put it all together before you go to work in the morning. And then when you come back, you have a stew that the house smells terrific. And the stew looks about like this. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do to make this even a little bit more attractive was to stir in a few peas. So these are just frozen peas. That I microwave just a short period of time, and I'm going to add them pretty much right before we are going to use them. I microwaved, I've got a cup here, I microwaved them for about 3 minutes, and notice how much more attractive that is. If we would have added the peas early on, then the peas would have turned that olive brown too, and they wouldn't look nearly as good. Now this method of cooking is great if you're using the cuts from the shoulder, from the lower rump, from the leg. This method works extremely well because they need a lot of long fibers, and we need to cook them long enough to tenderize them. Otherwise you have something that's simply too tough and too chewy to eat. If, however, you have cuts from the back of the animal or the loin of the animal, then cooking it very quickly at a very high heat would be your best approach. If you have cuts that are sort of in between, from the lower part of the rump, for instance, then you can cook with either method. If you want to cook it with this method, you simply follow the procedures that we've talked about here. You could also stew it in a regular kettle on the range. You could stew it in the oven or braise it. Anything that adds time and adds moisture to it that keeps it closed would be a good method when you're looking for long, slow, moist heat. If, however, you want to take those same cuts that are kind of in between and cook them in methods that normally we would reserve for a leaner or a more tender cut, then what you need to do is tenderize them before you cook. And by doing that, what you're simply going to do is either pound them with a meat mallet, or you can cook them first and then slice them very, very thin against the grain, and that will enable you to grill or broil or pan fry some of the cuts that normally we would tell you to use with long, slow, moist heat cooking methods. I think these are recipes on the CD that you'll find very useful for either kinds of cuts that you have, for all the cuts that you'll have that as you look at doing some nice, tasty things with the deer that you've harvested. One of the great benefits of having deer is that you have meat for an extended period of time, and so you have things that you can eat for months on end. But in order to make that work, you have to know how to safely prepare the food. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is making jerky, which is one of the favorites of a lot of folks because they can easily take them with it. It's way less expensive to make it yourself than it is to buy it at the market, and you can get the flavor the way you want it. But there's some things that you have to do, and you have to do safely. First of all, you want to make sure that the meat you're using is safe to use, that you've used a deer that you knew was healthy before you shot it or killed it, and then you make sure that you field dress it in such a way that you keep any fecal matter away from it. It's not uncommon for fecal matter to contaminate other parts of the meat, but you want to make sure that if that happens, you do not use that meat for jerky, because the methods that we use here to take care of E. coli and to bring it up to temperature may not work if there's a really high load of contamination. So the first thing I'm going to work on here is making a marinade, and here you have a lot of leeway. If you have a favorite marinade that you've been using for a long time, stick with it. But what I'm using here is I've got about 1.5 pounds, 1.5 to 2 pounds of meat that we've started with, and then I've got 1/4 cup of soy sauce. Now I'm using a reduced sodium soy sauce simply because I like the flavor. I don't want my jerky to taste real salty. And if you use a lot of ingredients that have salt in them, then over the drying process things get real concentrated, and it's real easy for things to have too much salt by the time you're done, even though they tasted fine at the beginning. Also to that, I'm going to add, let me see, I've got a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, and 2 teaspoons, 2 to 3, depending on how smoky you like it to taste, of liquid smoke. So we'll add those to this here. Now also, I'm going to add 1/4 teaspoon of onion powder, or excuse me, 1/2 teaspoon of onion powder, 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, and 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. Now, this doesn't look like a lot of marinade. We don't need a lot of marinade to go over this much meat. There will be some juices that will come out of the meat also as it cooks, or as it marinates. So we're just going to pour this over. Now, how long you let it marinate is going to affect how much flavor you get later on. So that if you want something that's just hinting at being marinated, then 2 hours in the refrigerator will probably be fine. If you want something with a lot more impact, then 8 hours, 10 hours overnight in the refrigerator will probably do you better. So again, that's going to depend. Now when you marinate it in the refrigerator, make sure that you cover it very tightly. It's nice if you put it in a real tight sealing plastic bag, and that way you can flip it over from time to time. If you've got it in a bowl like this, then you need to make sure that you stir it around every little bit to make sure that the marinade gets to all parts of the meat. Now, I'm going to skip a step here. I'm not actually going to put it in the refrigerator to marinate. Don't forget to do that, because otherwise you will have really wasted the marinade. I'm going to go on to the next step. Now, E. coli is a problem with venison, as it is with other types of meat. Whether you know you've contaminated it, or whether it was accidental contamination, or you're just eliminating any risk of contamination that might have taken place, you need to heat it before you eat it in one of 2 ways. And I'm going to show you the most effective way, and that's to heat it after the marinade has taken place. And we're going to bring it up to 160 degrees by boiling it, bring it to a boil, and boiling it for about 5 minutes in the marinade itself, and that's going to eliminate our problem. Or the potential risk of E. coli. So simply putting that in here, it's going to give you Our pan is really hot here. So it's going to give you a different flavor and a different texture than you may be used to because we're using this technique. But it also is going to make sure that the meat is safe. If you find that this is not something you're comfortable doing with, that you don't like the flavor of the meat that this is done with, then you have a second alternative, and that is to heat it up to 160 degrees after you have dried it. The problem with doing it that way is that it is not as effective as heating it while it's still in the marinade and before you've done the drying. The drying process reduces the effectiveness of the heat. You may still be ending up with some E. coli. And there have been numerous cases of people who have had E. coli as a result of consuming jerky. So we're just going to eliminate that problem by taking this one simple additional step. Again, simmer it for about 5 minutes. We're going to put a lid on it so that it has a better chance to heat clear through. And then we're going to check some of the pieces of meat with a thermometer to make sure we've gotten it up to 160 degrees. Okay, we've got this up to 160 degrees. It's probably a little bit higher than that, so you want to stop the cooking. We're actually not trying to cook it, but you notice you're going to get some of the changes in color and the changes of texture as a result of the cooking process, but it's really important to add that extra step. Then we're going to try and spread it out here and just let it drain a bit on some absorbent towels. You could either use this, or if you've got some relatively clean newspapers that you haven't read, you can put them on that. But that lets some of the liquid drain away. Since we're trying to dry this meat, we don't want to have anything extra here when we get on to the next phase. I didn't talk to you about how you cut the meat. You should cut it no more than 1/4 of an inch thick. Otherwise, it's not going to dry quickly enough. You can dry it, but it's going to dry unevenly and it's not going to work quite as well. So 1/4 of an inch thick, and then keep in mind that as it dries, you're going to lose moisture content, so that's going to get a little bit thinner as you go. The other thing that you want to think about is how you cut the meat. If you like jerky that's really chewy, then you cut with the grain so that it's got nice long fibers in it, and that will give you a nice chewy jerky. If you like it so that it's a little bit more tender and a little bit more brittle, then you slice it against the grain. Another tip is when you're slicing the meat, if you put it in the freezer for half an hour, it's going to come out, and while it's still frozen partially, you're going to be able to do that slicing a lot more easily. So we've got this meat, it's been cooked. Remember, this one is not going to be quite the color that you're going to get because we haven't marinated this one. We're going to put it on dryer trays. Now, I treated the dryer trays with a non-stick spray so that they would not stick to it and would be able to be removed later on. We don't have to turn them, so we just need to apply them. The dryer, however, does need to be preheated. I'm not doing that now because it's so noisy, but if you have this kind of a dryer at home, you want to do that. If you don't have a dehydrator or a dryer, then what you need to do is put it on oven racks and put your oven at its very, very lowest temperature, hopefully around 140 degrees, because that's the temperature that we want to dry the meat at. We want it to be hot enough that we can take care of bacteria early on and not leave it at an extremely low temperature of, say, around 120. You also want to spread it out so that it's relatively flat, and that's harder when you've done this because it tends to curl just a bit, but we want to spread it out on the dryer so that it's not touching. Even though there's going to be shrinking later on, we don't want to have anything overlapping that was going to cause this to change. So make sure that you've got plenty of room. Also have plenty of room for the air to circulate around it. If you dry it in your oven, make sure that as you go, you leave the oven door propped open so that you have plenty of that to allow the steam that's in there to come out, because you're evaporating the steam, and if the environment is heavily humid, it's going to take a lot longer for the drying process to occur. Another benefit of doing this, besides the food safety benefit, is that once you have heated the meat in up to 160 degrees in the marinade before you start drying, it dramatically cuts the amount of time it takes. Normally, without any of that happening, it would take 10 to 12 hours for the dryness to occur. You need to start checking this after 3 hours. It really, really shortens it down an amazing amount of time. So get all your pieces on here. Then you're simply going to put the lid to our dryer on. You'd already have the dryer itself on. Dry it somewhere between 130 to 145 degrees. Check it after 3 hours, and you end up with something that looks similar to this. Now, you should begin to check it when the meat bends when you cracks when you bend it, but doesn't actually break. This one I think is a little bit more dry. It doesn't hurt it if it gets too dry. This one's doing fairly well. But you can see that it's not actually breaking in two. Some of the pieces that I did yesterday actually snapped. Also do that checking after the meat has cooled down, otherwise it's not going to work for you. And then if you didn't do that heating ahead of time, then take this meat and put it in the oven at 275 degrees for about 10 minutes, and then check the temperature again. It's a little bit hard to check the temperature when things are this thin, but put it with a couple of pieces stacked together and slide a thermometer in there and make sure that you get it up to 160 degrees before you begin to store it. Store the meat in something that is moisture vapor proof, either a glass jar or a freezer container, something that will really keep it nice and tight. Vacuum packing it is an excellent choice, but whichever method you use, if you leave it at room temperature, it's going to keep about a week to 2 weeks. If you put it in the refrigerator, it'll keep 3 to 6 months, and if you put it in the freezer, it'll keep for about a year. So you get a lot of extended storage by putting it in the freezer, but the reason you did this may be so that you don't have to have that much freezer space, but because it's dried, it takes up less room, so it kind of works together. It depends on what your plans are for the meat and how soon you expect to have another deer. You can do similar things. If you run out of venison, you can do it with other kinds of meat, but venison is something really special. Now, there are other methods that people use to preserve meat. Canning is another one. If you choose to can your meat, you must have a pressure canner. There's no two questions about it, no two ways about it. You must have a pressure canner in order to get the meat hot enough for long enough to be safe. It depends on your altitude as to what the exact pressure will be. In this kind of a canner, which is a dial gauge canner, it will be somewhere between 11 to 13 pounds for most places in Oklahoma. And it will be 75 minutes for quarts and 90 minutes, 75 minutes for pints and 90 minutes for quarts. So it's a very lengthy process, but once you finish it, that meat can then be stored at room temperature. Make sure you get a canning guide that's current. If you have one that's dated before 1988, you need to check online with the National Center for Home Food Preservation, or check on your DVD to make sure that you get the current times and temperatures. The directions are in there. Make sure you follow them very, very closely, because if you don't, it's not E. coli that we're worried about in this case, it's botulism poisoning. So make sure you do it very well. But once you get it done, it doesn't cost you anything to keep it any longer. Just put it on the shelf in a cool, dry, dark place, and you're good to go for a couple of years. The last method that a lot of people use with deer is to freeze it. Now, when you use meat in the freezer, you want to put it in portion sizes that are what you expect to use at one meal. So 1 pound, 2 pounds, depending on how you normally would use it later on. The way you put it in there also makes a difference on how long it will keep. If you grind it up, it's going to keep a much shorter time, maybe 3 months. If you put it as stew meat, it will keep slightly longer than that. If you leave it in steaks and roasts, it will keep anywhere from 8 months to a year. So the way it's stored there affects how much air is into it and how much bacteria is in it, and that affects the length of time in the freezer. Freezer should be set at 0 degrees when you're ready to go. Package it, as I said, so that you have as much moisture vapor proof. One of the most common methods today is a freezer bag. Very, very easy to do. Make sure that you get the air out of it in some method as much as you can when you put it in there. So use the size of bag that's appropriate for the amount of meat that you're going to use. Vacuum packing is another method that works very, very well, but the cost of the vacuum packaging unit can be relatively high if you get one that's fairly nice. So consider that in the cost. A lot of folks consider deer meat to be free meat, which when you look at the cost of the gun, the ammunition, the transportation, the license, and all those kinds of things, it's not anywhere near free. It's fun meat and it's good meat, but there is a cost to it, and freezing increases the cost, because every minute that it's in the freezer, you're paying for the electricity, so that increases the cost of the meat. So you want to use it before it has time to go bad. You want to package it in such a way that you don't get freezer burn on it. You can do that also in butcher paper, which is a kind of paper that has smooth, just paper on one side and a waxy feel or a shiny feel on the other side, and you put that side against the meat, and there's a special fold, and that's included on your DVD as well. These are all excellent methods to preserve the venison that you have managed to track down and hunt. Any one of them will work, and any one of them will provide you with nutritious foods throughout the year. I hope you'll give it a try.